Hi class, welcome back. We are going into content that's going to transition us from period 1 into period 2 today. We're going to continue to work on a look at some of our kind of summer homework information. For my classes, we're talking about period 2 information, again, looking at the context for the entire course. And what we're going to do is we're going to start with a little bit of an analysis of an activity looking at this painting. This painting is a depiction of one of the colonies of New Spain. This is going to be just kind of one attempt for us to take a look into these colonies. Now, this may be based off background knowledge. This may be some information that you have had absolutely zero experience with if you haven't finished your summer homework at this time, but we're going to continue to look at this the more that we go. So the first thing I want you to do is I want you to take some time right now, pause the video, and look at this painting. Look for things, right, that we can point to make claims about colonial New Spain. What things do we see? What traits do we know? What claims might we be able to make based on this painting? Pause it now if you need to. So, when you take a look at this, there may be a few things that you may have noticed. One thing individuals might have seen was what looks like slave labor in the back. We see an individual right here. This is his whip, a bullwhip, a slave driver of sorts. We see another individual right here using this plow. And so they're using this land. Now, we see that the whites, the Spaniards, are conducting business. They're not the ones being enslaved. They're pushing people, right, telling them what to do. In this case, what appears to be indigenous Americans, Native Americans here, being forced to work in March, carrying that log. This will be a part of something that we're going to call the encomienda system, which is going to be a slave labor system using native slavery rather than African slave labor. We see them carrying the trees, but also taking down the trees down here in the back. But we also see something much darker the deeper we look into the photos, where we have individuals being hung way back here in the background, for example. We also see individuals mining, right? So we see a variety of different forms of slave labor. Some parts much, much more cruel than others in terms of how slavery goes. But we definitely see slavery being a key component here, and it appears to be that these are Native Americans. We also see other individuals, Spaniards, trading of sorts. We see individuals right here appears to be trading gold coins. We see them bringing over a different animal like oxen on horseback here. We also see much more brutal depictions of slavery. It appears to be branding or pulling out teeth, some sort of torture perhaps of these indigenous people. Maybe these are African Americans being brought in. We also see the presence and the importance of religion here, perhaps. Maybe this was something that you noticed as well, whether it was the cross or the monk right here or the monk in the back, right, or throughout. And so we see this different depiction about all these different components of New Spain. And we can use this as a source in the same way that we could use a text account in a different lens. Now, we would look at this for certain biases, maybe through the source information. Maybe this was made later. Maybe it was made by an Englishman or a Frenchman, maybe depicting the cruelty of things. Maybe this was made by a Spaniard. Depending on when this made, maybe there's a personal agenda or objective that's trying to be accomplished by this. So this is just one way that we can look at information. We're going to go deeper today about the differences between the colonies, because not all colonies are like this. There are a couple different colonies that we're going to be looking at today, and so we're going to look at the general trends about why are they settling the way that they are, and some long-term trends that we can see about developments about why these things do occur. It's really going to tie into our next video. So today, if you're basing this off of your summer homework, you should be able to reference summer homework activities number 3 and 4 with this content today. Our key concepts before we really get rolling, we need to make sure that we understand the scope of what's happening here. We're talking about the growth of the Spanish Empire in particular today. We're going to start with the Spanish but also explain how and why Europeans and natives engaged with each other, and how the perspectives of each other developed and changed during this time period. In general, lots and lots of misunderstandings of each other and lots of confusion. Also looking about the effects of this transatlantic voyage, the Columbian Exchange. But we're also going to take this a little bit deeper into period two, looking at the context for colonization of North America, when we talk about the English more specifically. We're looking at the context in which why that happens and how specific we will get into that in future videos, explaining how and why different European colonies developed and expanded during this time period. Also looking at how and why the environment and other factors shape the development of these colonies, right? In particular, the British, because this is U.S. history, there's going to be a deeper connection there, and cause effects of the transatlantic trade over time as well. So the big thing that you've noticed with all these objectives so far is we're looking at why did these colonies develop the way that they did. Part of it could be environmental, part of it could be social, part of it could just be the reasons why they come and the type of people that come over. That's deeply going to affect the way that these colonies do develop. And we're going to see differences in general today between the different European nations that we'll be looking at colonizing North America. We'll start with the largest, most expansive in the New World in both North America, Central America, and South America, the Spanish colonies. We'll look at New Spain first. So the Spanish colonies are deeply going to be settling in what is modern day Central America, modern day Mexico, the Caribbean, flowing all the way towards South America, but also the modern day southwest of the United States, all the way through kind of the Gulf Coast into Florida. They're also going to take over a large portion of South America. The only major significant portion they don't control in South America would be what becomes modern day Brazil, which will be owned by the Portuguese. Now, when we're talking about why these individuals came over, it is super important. We're looking at the effects or the impacts of the Columbian Exchange. And after Columbus sails the ocean blue in 1492, we see the ripple effects afterwards. We're going to see the Spanish really dominate Central and South America, the southeast and southwestern sections of North America, of the modern day United States. And this is going to leave a lasting impact for a number of reasons. We can see cultural impacts inside each of these countries or even states, and even just the development about how and why they develop the way that they do. So the Spanish are going to come over and they're going to settle. The actual first settlement in the New World is going to be a Spanish one, St. Augustine in Florida. But they're going to traverse all over what is modern day United States, all the way across what's sometimes called the Sun Belt, that extends kind of the lower half of this country all the way across to the West Coast, and then down through modern day Mexico. There's going to be deep settlement there. The Spanish conquistadors really explored for gold and silver, so they were looking to get rich and they were looking for these precious metals, especially after contact with the Aztecs and the Mayans. And another big component of the Spanish colonization patterns involves missionaries to convert Native Americans to Catholicism. We are going to see the settlement of missions, not just for religious means, but for controlling and patrolling different areas. They're sort of built like forts at times. But there's a cultural conversion that is attempting to be happening with these natives, and try to establish more permanent settlements. But even though the Spanish are going to have the largest out of any European nation in terms of territorial geographic size, they are going to be sparsely populated because it is so massive, and it's going to be very hard for them to control. The government of the Spanish colonies is heavily royal controlled. They were funded and controlled by the monarchs, and so because of that, they are not going to have much autonomy individually. It's going to be deeply in the root of the control of the monarch of Spain, the King and Queen of Spain. Their economy is based off this central desire for wealth, and in order to achieve said wealth, they're going to use Indian labor and then eventually African slave labor to mine gold and silver. The use of natives is the primary workforce of what's known as the encomienda system, where they will encourage Spaniards to come to the New World, set up home. They will be given natives as slaves to manually harvest a lot of times, or mine these areas, hoping to get rich, and that those Spaniards will hopefully settle in those areas. These encomiendas are plantations in order to farm cash crops. So it's a very similar model to what we're going to see in the antebellum South as we get closer and closer to the Civil War, to the middle of this course. The Spanish colonies societally had a very rigid caste system. A caste system is a social hierarchy in where one cannot escape certain platforms. No matter what they do, it is impossible. This is a depiction of what that would look like. This is in Spanish, and so at the very, very bottom, 2% of the Spanish colonies were Africans that were brought over. And so if you were in that percentage, you were absolutely on the farthest rung, and there was nothing you could do to get out of it. Above them were the Native American populations. The Native American populations were a large portion. Now, they were considered less than the Europeans, but they were above the Africans. Then you see this bunch called the mestizos. The mestizos, and also another group called the mulattoes, are going to be biracial individuals that are a byproduct of Europeans intermarrying and reproducing with both African slaves and Native Americans. And so the mestizos are going to be part indigenous people, Native American and European, so part Native and part European, and the mulatto is going to be part European and part African American. So there's going to be a hierarchy in social acceptability, but in this case, you see the mestizos are above the indigenous Americans, and the reason why is because they have part European blood. The Creoles, the Creole kind of natives, more European, again, farther removed from the indigenous people. At the very, very, very top, the smallest portion of society in the Spanish colonies are the Europeans, the Spaniards from Europe that are at the absolute top of this pyramid. So it's a very rigid social hierarchy in the Spanish colonies. The French colonies are quite different than the Spanish, and we're going to draw some comparisons and also contrast these two quite frequently. The French are not going to settle in the same areas as the Spaniards, so they're not really going to have any major conflicts with them, although there will be this kind of competition for land as a whole. The only area that they would really run into each other would be more so down at the base of the Mississippi River, modern-day Louisiana, New Orleans area, as there is Spanish Florida, and then the rest of New Spain over on the west of them. But they're going to settle heavily in modern-day Canada, the upper Midwest, Michigan, Detroit area, and all the way down the Mississippi River. The reasons why the French come over, a French explorer, Champlain, is going to attempt to find a northwestern passage to India. Originally is kind of the goal, to get to Asia for trade reasons, but he stumbles upon this land that we call Canada and founds the city of Quebec. The French crescent, which is kind of the area in which they control, it's kind of this arced moon shape that we see in population included. Canada, the Mississippi River, and all the way down to New Orleans. And so there's heavy French influence. And there's going to be a big impact on early American society. There's going to be a lot of overlap here, especially once we purchase this land that is encompassed in the Mississippi River and New Orleans. But the Mississippi River is very valuable. It's this giant waterway in the center of the continent, and it is going to be extremely useful in navigating and traversing the interior parts of this country. At the time, it is the highway, if you will, of its day. It is the fastest form of transportation, shipping goods, shipping people, expediting this process at a much greater rate. There are missionaries in the French colonies, but it's not as much as we are going to see with the Spanish. The French are coming over more so for economic means more than anything else. They will convert some Native Americans to Catholicism, but they will not be doing the enslaving we see in the encomienda system under the Spanish system. This is this so-called French crescent we see here in blue, right, depicting this area that we're talking about where we're seeing French settlement. And again, we do see conversion, we do see the establishment of missions, which really turn into more so of forts, especially along waterways to protect the economic interest that the French have. But because they're coming over here, not really to necessarily start a brand new life, but for more so trade networks, they are going to develop a very different relationship with the natives, number one. And number two, in their settlement patterns, they're not going to have this massive control, but they're also not going to be densely packed and populated because they're only coming over for trading. The government of the French colonies are very, very similar to the Spanish colonies, where it's also heavily controlled by the royals in France. The French colonies were relatively strictly controlled by royal governors, so people that were appointed by the French government. The economy was based around this desire for a fur trade. And most French colonists really profited off of this fur trade, small scale farming, even the use of lumber and the trade of lumber. But think about the fur trade especially, right? There are animals indigenous to North America, for example, like the North American beaver that are very furry little animals. If you can capture them, skin them, take those, you can sell them back in France. And think about the type of people that are buying furs. Who wears fur jackets, right? Who's wearing these fur sort of throws and scarves? It's going to be the really, really wealthy. And so you can fetch a really, really good price for these. So because they're emphasizing their control around the fur trade, they're going to have a much more amicable relationship with the natives who are going to help them with these furs. They are going to trade their supplies with the natives for these furs. Meanwhile, the Spanish are going to be basing more on cash crops and mining, trying to get rich that way. But the French are going to have to trade with the natives, and so in order to trade with the natives, you need to be on their good side. In order to be on their good side, you need to be friendly. You need to be good neighbors. You need to treat them like business partners, and you need to treat them well so they'll treat you well. And so this is really going to start to affect the social aspect of the French colonies. This is so important because once we get into actually the development, there's going to be heavy intermarrying between the French and the natives. For the Native Americans, trading was not just an economic practice, it was a friendship, it was an alliance. So it was a bonding ritual. It was deeper than just trading coin and money. That didn't matter to them. It was more about the deeper alliance and friendship. And so the society is going to be much more open and willing to work with the Native Americans, which is going to be a key reason why almost all of the major native forces are going to side with the French in the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War taking place in North America. This is just one example of a trade of using a peace pipe and working with the natives rather than subjugating them, right? Enslaving them, working with them. This is also another depiction, all right? The trading of the furs with the natives for rifles. And so this relationship back and forth is going to be mutually beneficial. In order to keep up this beneficial relationship, you need to keep up a good friendship as well. Next, we're going to talk about a group that most people forget because their territory is so small, but it's going to be increasingly important, the Dutch. The Dutch colonies in North America are seemingly short-lived, but it's going to be very, very important when we're talking about English history. Now, the Dutch colonies are trying to establish New Amsterdam, their territory, as a trade center. Their trade center is going to become modern-day New York City. New Amsterdam City is what we would call New York City. The Dutch colonies are going to be invaded and taken over by the English, who are going to engulf them on the north, the New England colonies and the Chesapeake colonies like Jamestown. And so the Dutch are going to be relatively short-lived, but their motivations are going to create a very, very valuable colony. Politically, economically, and socially, in order to attract settlers, the government allowed anybody to immigrate to this area. So it's going to create a very, very unique, diverse settlement. But they're not going to have a lot of backing. The Dutch don't have the money to throw at and protect it, and so the English are going to swallow them up. New Amsterdam really becomes one of the most diverse colonies in North America, and when the English swallow it up, it becomes New York, and then is divided into future places like New Jersey. Pennsylvania will be settled, which eventually will give up to Delaware. The middle colonies, and the middle colonies, especially New York and New York City, are going to be the most diverse in every single setting, politically, economically, and socially, because of all of these different immigrants from different nationalities, even different races, different cultures, different religions, all in one area. The English colonies, which is going to be probably the most important for us in this class, the reason why most of us are all here, is we have to look at English lineage. Why do the English as a whole come to America? In the 1600s, the English settlers really start arriving in North America for the first time. The first permanent, successful permanent English settlement is going to be in 1607 with the colony of Jamestown. But it's not as simple to say, okay, from there, the rest is history, everything's fine. There's a lot of different challenges that are seen. But why we're looking at the English in a large term, we really need to look at what makes them unique and why are we really studying the English. The English are very different from the Spanish and the French, and one of the key reasons why is because the English government, the British Crown, had absolutely no desire to really create a centralized empire in the New World. So there's going to be little or sparsely scattered royal backing until these colonies become successful, and so it's going to take a while before that happens. They're not going to be as expansive, perhaps, as the Spanish or the French, but they're going to be very, very unique. What makes, I think, the English colonies more unique than any other European colony set, and I'm not just saying this for U.S. history's sake, but for all of them, is because of the vast amount of different motivations by English settlers. All of the colonies become incredibly unique. The 13 colonies are not this super unified, lumped group. They're all so incredibly unique with their own histories, their own stories, their own settlers, their own personalities, heroes. And so because of that, that really develops the personality of those colonies. And that's so incredibly important. We're going to look at that a little bit deeper, but that's a huge, huge idea for the rest of this course, right? The motivations for why people come over are going to dictate how the colonies develop. In England in the 17th century, there were a lot of different social challenges. And remember, when we're talking about the 17th century, it's the 1600s, right? It's a year behind because the first century was year 0 to 100, so on and so forth. So the 17th century is the 1600s. And during the 1600s in England, there was this massive boom in population. And this is going to drastically change everything, this industrialization or rather even urbanization. Because of this huge boom in population, things are going to become heavily crowded. There's this massive competition for things like land, food, and jobs, right? Things that everybody wants in order to survive or be successful. And because of that, it was a very mobile population in England. They're kind of like vagrants. They're moving from place to place where the jobs are, where the food is, where the opportunities are. And it's going to be very, very mobile. It's not going to be that stationary. And so because of that, people are looking for better situations because it's not really working for a lot of individuals. There's a lot of disparity and inequality, but people did have choices, especially if you weren't already living in the cities. You had the option to move to those cities to try to find better work, food, jobs, occupations. You could move to Ireland, you could move to the Netherlands, or you could move to America. And so many people took these different options. But what's important to understand is this trip to America is easily the most expensive and the most dangerous. But the idea was that there was this huge reward that could be gained, this huge, immense amount of freedom. But not everybody had that opportunity to really make it to the New World. And the British colonies are the 13 colonies as we know them. But for example, the middle colonies of like New York are really going to be originally the Dutch that are going to be swallowed up by the New England colonies, the Chesapeake colonies down below them of Virginia and Maryland, and then the rest of the southern colonies in both the Carolinas and Georgia. All of these different colonies are going to have different reasons for people to come over, and it's going to affect the culture. And we're going to go deeper into that into our next video. The motivations in general, it's really hard to label down for the British, unlike the others. The motivation for the British were very, very broad, and that's what makes them so unique. You'll have some that are economic, to escape poverty, gain a lot of wealth from cash crop farming, like people settling in Virginia that eventually try to make it rich. First, by finding precious metals, they figure out that they're not there, and then they shift towards a cash crop agriculture once tobacco is introduced. Religious, people escaping for religious freedom because they want to choose their own religion, or because they're being persecuted as a minority in Europe. And so they are going to try to escape to the New World. You're going to see the setup of New England with the Puritans in Massachusetts, or perhaps the Quakers being religiously tolerant to so many different people in Pennsylvania. You're also going to have political. There's this fear of destruction during the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. And so people are trying to escape their war-torn country and all of the political upheaval. And so they're looking for a greater say, they're looking for a greater voice, they're looking for safety or just a better life in general. That's why people move throughout all of history. Why do people move? They're looking for a better life. Now, as a result of this, the British colonies are all very different. They're not very united because there isn't this connective string between them, except for the fact that they're British. They're also unique in their internal motives. And so because of that, it's not just their motives, but also the way that they're settled. Some of them are private sort of corporations, joint stock companies. Some of them are royal colonies, and some are mixed in between, and they're settled for different reasons. And so they're all very, very unique. And we're really going to get into that into our next video. The government in the British colonies were different than the French and the Spanish because the British government didn't really have this desire to create that centralized empire. So they weren't heavily in oversight. It was not heavily about royal control in the colonies. And so it allows them a heavy amount of freedom, especially compared to the French and the Spanish. This policy where the British government would purposely not enforce these strict laws upon the colonies in North America as long as they were producing um, their economic means and following up on their end was called salutary neglect. They were officially sort of neglecting or turning a blind eye to what was going on. And this allows colonists to create local laws, create taxes in their colonial assemblies. And even in the early 1600s, mid 1600s, we're going to see this history of participatory democracy. And so by the time the revolution really breaks out, this is going to be ingrained in the colonies in some cases all the way back into the 16 teens, 1620s. And so this is going to be a really hard thing to shake once the British start to exert a tighter control after the French and Indian War. And lastly, we're going to see kind of some royal governors sent by the king. And so there is some sort of presence, but they really didn't have that much power as compared to what you would see in the French and the Spanish colonies. This is sort of an example of kind of what would happen, the hierarchy in the colonial government. You have, of course, the crown at the very, very top that appoint a royal governor, and the governor of the colony could appoint a council that's sort of an advisory board and kind of the highest court in each colony. And then you have the colonial assembly that's elected by sort of the constituents, the colonists. They made laws, they had the power to tax, they were the people that paid the governor's salary, and so they had a lot of control for sure. There's a lot more of this back and forth in which the colonists, the individual citizens, not those just in the upper crust of society, are able to actually participate. Now, not everybody is going to fit into the colonial assembly. There are different participation laws and rules in each colony, but this is starkly different than most other colonies, one in North America, around the world at this time by far. Economically, socially, again, they were so dependent upon the reasons why people settled, so I can't really label them into one lump, but we're going to cover that again more so in our next video. But really, the big thing to understand about the British colonies is they're so incredibly unique. Kind of all of the three G's are found here, and it's going to be different depending on which colony or even colonial region that you look at. For example, the southern colonies like Virginia had a cash crop economy. It was very aristocratic. There's a huge gap between the rich and the poor. Like the rich being the plantation owners, the poor being maybe subsistence farmers, we'd call yeoman farmers, and then eventually slave labor. The New England colonies were heavily connected with religion, and so they weren't really emphasizing this massive attempt to become filthy rich. And really, they had subsistence farming. They didn't really have this desire to make money. And so, because of the reasons why those people came over, it completely dictates their economy. And really, unlike the Spanish and the French, the British colonists never really had this huge attempt to convert, marry, or trade with the local Native Americans. There was conflict over the land. They didn't want to be around them, but it was not as direct relationship as you would see with the Spanish and the French. And the best way to sum this up is through a quote from General Patton. Famed American World War II general, right? It says basically, if you have a relationship with me, if you're in my group, if you're in my unit, right, you can do three things, right? You can lead me, you can follow me, or you can get the hell out of my way, right? And that's kind of the relationship we can divide up between the different European colonies with their relationship with the natives. The French want the natives to lead them. They want them to show them their ways, show them what their culture is like so that they can trade. The Spanish want them to follow them. They want to subjugate them, enslave them with the encomienda system for manual labor. And the British want them to get out of their way. They just want their land. They don't want much to do with them whatsoever. They just want them to leave so they can take up their land. That's going to lead to a lot of different fights. So the North American continent, the United States as we know it today, in the 1600s and 1700s would look something like this, carved up by many different countries, fighting for land, fighting for control of resources, fighting over border disputes. And this is really going to bleed into a lot of future issues as these become more developed, as the money and the resources become higher stakes. It's going to break into all-out war in this fight for control to kind of expel the other countries. And we're going to see this continue throughout the 1700s. It's going to only escalate by the middle of the 1700s. And when we go all the way back to even kind of the beginning of where this happens, in the early 1600s, we see the early English settlements along with the French settlements and the continual Spanish settlements. There were massive territorial claims. But the big problem is they're not heavily populated. More so the French and the Spanish, because they were so large, they weren't able to fill these out, even though they claimed this massive amount of land. So it made it hard at times to really control these claims from Native Americans, from people encroaching upon lands. The lines were very, very blurred. And a lot of these claims that happen because they're trying to take it up before the other European nations take up this land, it's really going to come at the expense of a lot of the native tribes there. And the native tribes are going to get caught in the crossfire of this imperialistic competition. Now, we've looked at a lot of different images today and a lot of similar structures, and it's easy to blur all this stuff together. But a great way to review these different colonies, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and the British, is to take a look at attempting to place individuals based on what they want to do as to where they might possibly settle. So I'm going to give you a slide. And what I want you to do is when it gets to the slide, pause it. I'm going to pause for just a couple seconds. I'm not going to say anything to give you time to pause it. And I want you to look at who this individual is. I'm going to describe them to you. And based on the information you have, where do you think they might settle? Now, there could be more than one right answer. You can be very specific in some of your answers. Some of them you can be more broad. You can just say the country, but maybe into the British. You're probably going to have better background knowledge on that. You can be more specific where in the British colonies they might settle, for example, but determine what is the best colonial region for that person to move to, and a brief explanation really that just supports what you're deciding. So really think about this in the sense of trying to synthesize information, because the AP organization will do this on the multiple choice section where they'll say, which one of these individuals will most likely believe this thing? So we're kind of reverse engineering that. For example, we're going to take a look at our potential immigrant number one. Our first immigrant, our first individual is a poor, unmarried man looking to make himself rich, looking for his fortune. Now remember, this could be placed in more than one area, right? So you just need to provide justification for your rationale. Which colony would they go to and why? I'm going to pause talking for a couple seconds. You can pause your video if you need to. Think about where would you place this individual and why? So some of you may have come up with the idea of the Spanish, right? Maybe this person is a conquistador that is looking to make themselves rich and try to find gold and precious metals, and they could do that, and that could be an acceptable answer. Maybe this person wants to settle in New France because they want to be a part of the fur trade and become very wealthy with trading with Native Americans. That could be a good answer. Perhaps they are going to want to go to New Amsterdam and settle in New Amsterdam City, this major trade port where they hopefully can make himself very, very rich based off the trade networks. Or maybe they are going to settle in the colony of Jamestown, and maybe they'll try to get rich off the tobacco industry that eventually booms in the later mid-1600s, that black gold. So any one of these could have been the correct answer, and that's why I always start with this one. It's a really, really important thing to do. It could be for any reason you want, but make sure that you can explain your rationale. In this course, it doesn't necessarily matter what you choose to argue, as long as you can back it up. Do you have the receipts? Do you have the evidence? Do you have the proof? If you don't, then you're wrong. If you do, then you can be right. It's all about argumentation. Why is it you think you're right? Potential immigrant number two. Our potential immigrant number two is a person who has very, very religious beliefs. Take a minute, pause the video if you need to. So, where might someone settle if they're religiously motivated? Maybe they settled in the French territories as part of a mission, or in the Spanish territories for a similar reason. Maybe they settled up in New England for religious freedom to settle up, maybe with the Puritans, perhaps. Right? Each one of these regions could have been correct, and that's really what we're trying to see here. We're seeing some similarities between them. Now, some may stick out a lot larger than others, and that's okay. We may not think of the French right away when we talk about religion, and that's okay, but looking at some similarities we can see, or maybe places, where can we place this individual? Let's go to our next one. A person looking for political freedom and the ability to help make laws. Now, there's really only going to be one correct answer for this. One correct answer. So think carefully. Pause your video if you need to. Hopefully, you came up with the English colonies. The English colonies were the only colony that was really unique in the sense that they had political freedom and this ability to make laws for themselves. That's salutary neglect policy of the British government, because they didn't want to set up a centralized sort of government in the New World that allowed them to really govern themselves. Potential immigrant, that is a Native American who's looking for freedom from European control. A Native American looking for freedom from European control. Maybe you thought of the French because the partnership is very friendly. They're not really controlled. There's going to be heavy contact. And so maybe you interpreted control as more of a negative thing, and that's okay. They didn't want to be kind of subjugated. So kind of the wrong answer would be the Spanish, and we can work backward that way. So maybe the French would be a good answer because of the amicable relationship. But maybe some of you also could have said the English. The English don't really have a major influence on the natives in terms of wanting to be around them, so they want to be heavily separated. They want that disconnect from them. Get out of my way. Just give me your land and go away. And that could be an example of freedom from European control. Our potential immigrant who enjoys living where the action is, a place where something exciting is always happening, a very, very happening place. Now, that could mean a couple of different things to you. But take a minute and think, what might this possibly mean? So you might not have a direct answer on this one right away, and you're thinking, I don't know, what could it possibly be? But we can think about places that it's not first, and we can take an educated guess. First, let's talk about the Spanish. Were the Spanish heavily populated? Absolutely not. Much, much too large. The French, similarly, also not densely populated. Now, the English, you could make maybe an argument here, but I think the best possible argument would be for the Dutch in eventually New York City, New Amsterdam, that heavy trade hub, all these different people flooding in, different cultures, different people, economic trade, and that could be a really good answer for us here. And lastly, this is going to be our last immigrant. Our potential immigrant is an entrepreneur looking for a location to open a business specializing in shipping. Specializing in shipping. Take some time to think about it. Now, it probably won't be the Spanish because that doesn't really fit our mold here. It could perhaps be the French if you argued that the use of the Mississippi River to ship out could be very valuable, like shipping the fur trade. But I think there's some even better options. Perhaps the Dutch, again, with New York City being a great trade hub and shipping in and out. Or if we look at the British, in particularly New England, shipbuilding, coastal regions, it's easy to ship back and forth with the English because they are geographically the closest back to Europe. And so this could be very beneficial for them when we're talking about markets and trading and a lot of people coming in and out right on the eastern seaboard. So this is just one activity. It may not have gone over perfect for you, but hopefully you can see some trends. And if there's some area that you really struggled with, maybe you can go back in the notes and fill in those deficiencies. That's going to be it for this video. In our next video, we are going to take a deeper look. It's going to be a big video, a longer one, and we're going to look into the North American colonies for the British, what we call the 13 colonies. And we're going to look at each colonial region, why they developed the way that they do in much more depth. And we're going to spend a lot more time on some individual stories. Specifically, we're going to spend a lot of time in the Chesapeake colonies and in the New England colonies in our next video. But if you had any questions about today's video, feel free to drop a comment down in the section below, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Peace.